Ruth had always lived a quiet and simple life, moving from one housekeeping job to another, never staying long enough for anyone to really know her. When she was hired to work at the Grand Weston mansion, she told herself it was just another house, another set of rooms to clean, another set of people to serve. The mansion was enormous, filled with the kind of beauty she had only seen in magazines: tall marble pillars, glittering chandeliers, and walls lined with expensive paintings. Her footsteps echoed through the empty halls as she dusted tables and arranged flowers, her worn hands moving carefully over every polished surface. But one corner of the house always caught her eye, a long corridor lined with family portraits. Each painting seemed to whisper stories of pride, wealth, and history. One morning, while the sun streamed softly through the tall windows, Ruth climbed the small wooden ladder to clean the highest frames. She moved her cloth gently over the glass until she reached a portrait larger than the rest, a man in his 30s, sharp suit, calm eyes, and an expression of quiet strength. For a moment, she admired the painting's elegance, but then something in his face made her heart stop. The curve of his jaw, the gentle sadness in his eyes, the way his lips slightly curved when he smiled, it was all too familiar. Her hand froze mid-air, the duster slipping from her fingers and landing softly on the carpet below. She stepped down, trembling, her gaze locked on the portrait. It couldn't be possible. The man in the picture was Daniel Weston, the owner of the mansion, a respected businessman known throughout the city. But to Ruth, he wasn't a stranger. He was a little boy, the same boy she had once held close in a small orphanage years ago, the boy who used to call her Mama Ruth. Memories rushed back like a storm. She could almost smell the old wooden floors of the orphanage, hear the laughter of the children as they ran around the dusty courtyard, and see the little boy with messy brown hair who followed her everywhere. She remembered how he would sit beside her during meals, asking endless questions about life outside the orphanage. And she remembered the day he left, the day a rich couple arrived, promising him a better future. He had cried, clutching her apron, refusing to let go. "Please, Mama Ruth, don't let them take me," he had said. She had smiled through tears and told him everything would be all right. But after he left, she never saw him again. Now, years later, he stood before her once more, not in flesh, but in paint. Ruth felt her knees weaken as she stepped closer to the portrait. "It can't be," she whispered, her voice breaking. Her eyes filled with tears as she studied every detail, the same scar near his eyebrow from when he fell off the orphanage swing, the same dimple that appeared when he smiled. It was him. The realization hit her with a force she could barely contain. She looked around the room, afraid someone might see her trembling. How could fate be so strange? Out of all the houses in the world, she had come to work in the one owned by the child she had loved and lost. She wanted to ask someone to confirm it was really him, but she didn't dare. What if she was wrong? What if she was only imagining it because her heart missed him so deeply? She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to calm her racing heart. The silence of the mansion felt heavier now, almost alive, as if the walls themselves were keeping secrets. Every tick of the clock echoed in her ears. She wanted to look away from the portrait, but she couldn't. The boy she had once comforted through cold nights was now a man surrounded by everything she could never give him: wealth, status, and a world far from the loneliness of the orphanage. Yet his eyes in the portrait seemed to look right at her, as if he remembered too. Ruth stepped back, wiping her eyes quickly as she heard footsteps down the hall. She picked up the fallen duster and forced herself to keep cleaning, pretending nothing had happened. But inside her, everything had changed. That face, that familiar, beloved face, had awakened a part of her heart she thought had died long ago. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She moved quietly from room to room, yet her thoughts stayed in that hallway, with that portrait. By the time she left for the servants' quarters that evening, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't ignore what she had seen. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would find out the truth. But as she lay in bed that night, the image of the portrait haunted her, and one question kept echoing in her mind: would he remember her too? That night, Ruth lay awake on her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling while the faint sound of the ticking clock echoed through the still air. Sleep would not come. Every time she closed her eyes, the portrait appeared in her mind, Daniel's face, older, but unmistakably his. It felt impossible, yet her heart insisted it was true. Memories she had long buried began to surface, flooding her mind like a film she couldn't pause. She remembered the small orphanage on the edge of town, the cracked walls and creaky wooden floors, the sound of laughter mixed with crying, and the smell of porridge cooking every morning. She could see the children again, little faces filled with both hope and sadness, but one stood out among them, a thin boy with bright eyes and an unshakable spirit. Daniel. He had been quieter than most, always curious, always asking questions far beyond his age. "Mama Ruth," he would say softly, tugging at her sleeve, "will I ever have a family?" And she would smile, hiding the ache in her heart, and say, "Yes, my dear, one day, someone will see how special you are." She hadn't realized how soon that day would come. The memory of that winter night came back sharper than ever. Snow falling silently outside as a car arrived at the orphanage gates. A wealthy couple stepped out, their elegant clothes so out of place among the worn blankets and broken toys. They wanted a boy, a bright one, to raise as their own. Daniel had been chosen. Ruth remembered his face when she told him. He had cried so hard, clutching her skirt and refusing to let go. "Please, Mama Ruth, don't let them take me," he had begged, his voice cracking with fear. Her heart had broken that night, but she had forced herself to smile, to tell him it was a good thing, that this was the life he deserved. She watched from the window as the car drove away, his small face pressed against the glass, waving until the darkness swallowed the lights. She never saw him again, until now. Ruth turned on her side, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. How strange it felt to be under the same roof as him after all these years. He was no longer that frightened little boy. Now, he was a man surrounded by wealth, success, and people who probably adored him. She wondered if he even remembered her, or the life they once shared. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he had erased that painful chapter from his memory, but she couldn't. The bond between them had been real as any mother and son could have. She pressed her hand to her heart, whispering into the darkness, "Daniel, you grew up just like I prayed for." Yet the more she thought about it, the more restless she became. The thought of pretending not to know him felt unbearable. She wanted to look into his eyes and see if he still remembered the songs she used to hum when he couldn't sleep. The stories she told him about angels watching over lost children. But how could she do that now? To him, she was just a maid, another quiet woman in a uniform who cleaned his floors and served his meals. If she told him who she was, he might not even believe her. He might think she was just trying to seek attention or money. The fear of being dismissed or humiliated held her back, yet the ache in her chest wouldn't go away. She thought about the photo she still kept, the old picture of the two of them at the orphanage, his tiny arms wrapped around her neck. Maybe if she showed him, he would remember. But even then, what would she say? That she missed him every day? That she still prayed for him every night? Ruth sat up, pulling her blanket close, her heart beating fast. She knew she couldn't rest until she was certain. The truth had to come out, one way or another. She decided she would observe him closely, find a chance to talk to him, not as a maid, but as the woman who had once been his only family. Outside, the wind howled softly through the trees, rattling the window panes like whispers from the past. Ruth stared into the darkness, feeling both fear and hope twist inside her. Tomorrow, she promised herself, she would start looking for signs, something, anything, that could prove the boy she loved was still somewhere inside the man in that portrait. But as dawn slowly painted the sky, She couldn't shake the feeling that fate had brought her here for a reason, and that the story between her and Daniel was far from over. The next morning, the mansion was quiet, filled only with the faint sound of footsteps and the distant ticking of the clock. Ruth moved carefully through the hallway, her thoughts still trapped in the night before. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the image of Daniel's face again and again, torn between disbelief and longing. When she entered the kitchen, the head butler told her that Mr. Weston, Daniel, had returned home earlier than usual from his business trip. The news made her heart jump. She wasn't ready to face him, not yet. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared his morning tea, the fine china trembling against the tray. She took a deep breath and told herself to stay calm. To him, she was just another servant, invisible, unimportant, replaceable. Still, she couldn't help the racing of her heart as she walked toward the study. The large doors stood open, and inside, Daniel sat near the window, dressed neatly in a dark suit, reading a few papers. The morning light fell across his face, highlighting the same calm eyes she remembered from long ago. Ruth hesitated at the doorway for a second before stepping in quietly. "Good morning, sir," she said softly, setting the tray on the table. Daniel looked up, his expression polite but distant. His eyes met hers for only a moment, long enough for Ruth to feel something stirred deep inside, a trace of the boy he once was. But then he smiled faintly, not out of recognition, only kindness. "You're new here, right?" he asked in a gentle tone, unaware of how those simple words cut through her heart. Ruth nodded quickly, forcing a small smile to hide the storm inside her. "Yes, sir. Just a few weeks." Daniel nodded, turning back to his papers, his voice calm. "I hope the staff is treating you well." Ruth murmured something polite in return, though her throat felt tight. She wanted to tell him everything right there, to say, "Daniel, it's me, Mama Ruth, the woman who once sang you to sleep." But fear held her back. She didn't want to risk sounding foolish. Her trembling hands reached for the teapot to pour his cup. But as she leaned forward, something slipped from the pocket of her apron and fluttered to the floor. A small, faded photograph landed face up beside Daniel's shoe. Ruth gasped softly and bent to pick it up, but Daniel had already reached for it. He frowned slightly, studying the old image. It was a picture of a little boy with bright eyes, hugging a woman in a simple apron. The photo was worn around the edges, but the warmth it held was unmistakable. Daniel tilted his head, confused. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, curious but slightly tense. Ruth froze. Her lips parted, but for a moment, no words came out. Her heart pounded so hard she thought he could hear it. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to meet his eyes. "From the only child I ever called my own," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. The words hung in the air like a whisper of truth that couldn't be taken back. Daniel's expression shifted. He stared at her, then at the photograph again, his brow furrowed. Something in his eyes changed, a flicker, a tiny spark of recognition buried deep beneath years of forgotten memories. He looked closer at the picture, then back at her face. There was something familiar in her eyes, in the warmth of her expression, in the way she stood, steady but gentle. "This boy," he said slowly, "he looks like me." Ruth could only nod, tears beginning to form. Daniel leaned back in his chair, still staring, his mind trying to piece together fragments of his past. A faint image came to him, the scent of bread baking, a small hand patting his hair, a soft voice humming him to sleep. He shook his head, as if afraid to believe it. "It can't be," he murmured, but his voice lacked certainty. Ruth said nothing, afraid to push him too far. The silence stretched between them, heavy with emotion and questions neither of them could yet answer. Finally, Daniel set the photo gently on the table and looked at her once more. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. Ruth took a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around the tray. "Someone," she said softly, "who never forgot you." The words struck something deep within him. He didn't speak again, only stared, not at her uniform, not at her trembling hands, but at her eyes, as if trying to reach into the past through them. And for the first time, Ruth saw it, that faint glimmer of the little boy who once called her Mama. That evening, after the sun had gone down and the mansion had grown quiet, Daniel couldn't focus on anything. The photograph haunted him. He had placed it on his desk, but every time he looked at it, his chest tightened. The little boy in the picture looked too much like him as a child, and the woman beside him, her gentle smile, her kind eyes stirred a deep, unexplainable feeling inside him. He remembered flashes of warmth from his early years, though most of his childhood before the adoption had always been a blur. But that voice, soft, comforting, like a lullaby in the dark, he remembered that clearly. The voice that used to sing him to sleep when the nights were cold and lonely. Now, as he thought of the maid's trembling voice saying, "From the only child I ever called my own," his heart refused to rest. Finally, unable to ignore it any longer, Daniel rose from his chair and picked up the photo, gripping it gently, as if it were something fragile and precious. The corridors were dim as he walked toward the servants' quarters, his footsteps soft against the marble floor. The mansion felt colder that night, the silence pressing around him. He stopped at Ruth's door and knocked lightly. Inside, Ruth sat quietly, mending an old apron by the dim light of a small lamp. When she heard the knock, her hands froze. She wasn't expecting anyone, certainly not him. Her heart began to race. "Come in," she whispered, her voice unsteady. The door opened slowly, and Daniel stepped inside, still holding the photo. For a moment, he didn't speak. His eyes moved around the small room, the simple bed, the folded clothes, and on the small table, a worn Bible and a cup of cold tea. He turned back to Ruth, and there was something different in his gaze this time, not the polite distance of a master speaking to a maid, but a quiet searching, as if he was looking for a piece of himself. He held up the photograph. "Tell me," he said softly, his voice almost breaking, "was it you who used to sing me to sleep at night?" Ruth's lips trembled. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. Only tears ran down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "it was me." Daniel's shoulders fell as if the weight of years had suddenly pressed down on him. He sat on the small wooden chair beside her bed, staring at the photograph again, this time with tears glistening in his own eyes. Ruth began to speak, her voice low and trembling but full of warmth. She told him everything, how she had stayed behind at the orphanage after he left, caring for the other children who had no one else, how she never stopped thinking of him, and how she prayed every night that he had found a family who loved him. "I used to sit by the window," she said softly, "and imagine you growing up strong, safe, and happy. I wanted to look for you, but I had no way to find you. All I could do was hope." Daniel listened in silence, every word striking deep inside him. He remembered now the smell of soap on her apron, the warmth of her hugs, the songs she hummed when thunder frightened him. "I searched for you once," he admitted quietly, his voice shaking. "Years ago, when I was old enough to remember the orphanage, I went back, but they said you'd left long ago." Ruth smiled faintly through her tears. "I had to," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The orphanage closed, and I went where I could find work. But not a day passed when I didn't think of you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy with unspoken love and years lost to time. Daniel finally reached out, taking her wrinkled hands in his. "All this time," he murmured, "I thought I was alone before they found me. But now I know I wasn't." Ruth looked at him through blurred eyes, her heart swelling with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "You were never alone," she whispered. "You just didn't know someone was praying for you." The faint sound of the clock filled the silence that followed, marking the moment when both of them realized what fate had done. After decades apart, life had brought them together again, in the most unexpected way, not through plans or coincidence, but through something deeper, something meant to be. Daniel stayed there for a while, not speaking, just sitting beside her like the little boy who had once needed her warmth, and Ruth, for the first time in years, felt peace. She looked at him, and saw not the powerful man the world admired, but the same small boy who had once called her Mama. A few days passed after that emotional night, and Ruth returned to her usual work around the mansion, though everything felt different now. The air seemed lighter, the silence less heavy. Daniel had not spoken much after their conversation, but the kindness in his eyes when he left her room still lingered in her heart. She didn't expect anything more. Just knowing that he remembered her, even a little, was enough. She tried to push her emotions aside and continued her duties quietly. Then, one bright morning, the butler came to her and said, "Mr. Weston would like to see you in the living room." Her heart skipped a beat. Nervous but curious, Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and made her way down the long hallway. The door to the grand room stood slightly open, and as she stepped inside, she froze. The walls looked different. The large portrait of Daniel still hung in its place, but now something new stood beside it. Another painting, freshly framed and glowing in the soft morning light. Ruth's eyes widened as she took a step closer. It was a portrait of her, holding the hand of a small boy. The artist had captured every detail with love, the warmth in her smile, the tenderness in her eyes, and the innocent trust of the child beside her. It looked exactly like her and little Daniel from all those years ago at the orphanage. Ruth covered her mouth with a trembling hand, unable to believe what she was seeing. Just then, Daniel entered quietly behind her. He watched her reaction for a moment before speaking softly, his voice filled with emotion. "This house," he said, "was never truly complete until now." She turned toward him, eyes brimming with tears. Daniel smiled gently and added, "That portrait," he gestured to his own on the wall, "shows who I became. But this one," he looked at hers, "shows where I came from. The woman who gave me a family before I even had one deserves to be remembered here too." Ruth couldn't hold back her tears any longer. Her knees felt weak as emotion overwhelmed her. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. "You've already given me more than I ever dreamed of." Daniel stepped closer and shook his head softly. "You gave me love when I had nothing," he said. "You taught me what family means. Everything I am today began with you." Ruth looked at him through her tears, her heart full in a way it hadn't been for decades. In that moment, she no longer saw herself as a maid or a forgotten caretaker. She was seen, valued, and loved as a mother once again. The years of loneliness and silence seemed to melt away, replaced by warmth and peace. As Daniel gently placed his hand over hers, Ruth looked up at the two portraits side by side, the past and present reunited at last, and deep inside, she realized something she would never forget. Sometimes, life takes everything away, only to return it when your heart is finally ready to heal.